Thanks, Aaron, and welcome everyone. And excited to kick off, I think, a perfect kickoff to this City of the Futures edition leading into 2023, when we're going to talk about the role of resilience in the City of the Future, which, as anyone who's following this conversation probably interprets resilience in very different ways. So today we have two very distinguished guests to help us break down what this might mean and talk about some of the programs and projects they see out there, whether it's from the city side, whether it's from academia, or whether it's from the utility sector side. So please join me in welcoming our guest today. First is Ed Salzberg from George Washington University. Ed, welcome to City of the Future. Really excited to partner with you and GW on this event, but see if you want to take a few minutes just to introduce yourself and the things you're working on there at GW.
Oops. Thank you, Jason. I was still on mute, which is sort of the watchword of the pandemic era. Thank you for asking me to join. And I've worked with Jason for a long time. Maybe in 2015, I went to my first Z Prime event in Austin, just blown away with the quality of the panel and the attendees to it. And I'm pleased to bring him to George Washington University, where I run a energy resilience program. And so we're going to be running an event with GW people, but also people from around the world in our Cities of the Future event on DC. We've got a great venue for that, and I just encourage people to think about coming. There's lots to do in Washington, DC, so it's more than the conference. You can get involved in lots of culture and policy programming that's going on here. In addition to GW, I also run the Security and Sustainability Forum, and I think some of my subscribers are on here as well, where I do convene experts from around the world to address these kinds of issues. And there's really no more important issue right now than climate effects and what the City of the Future will look like, and how to get from where we are now to a more resilient, clean energy, equitable future. And I've got some remarks in a few minutes about that. But I think, Jason, do you want to introduce Carla too, or do you want me to just talk about something?
Yeah. And thanks, Ed. And Carla Perry from the Spectrum Group, Senior Counsel and Executive Vice President. Welcome to this session. Carla, would you mind spending a few minutes just talking about your very unique background and some of the things you're looking forward to discussing here in this session?
Hi, and thank you. Welcome, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today. My background is I've got a long time career working on Capitol Hill, both as a staffer and lobbyist. I'm a typical DC lawyer. I've been a consultant for about 20 years with the Spectrum Group. I'm a member, and I also have my own consulting firm. What I'm really intrigued by is the opportunity to merge the public and private sector in a very different way than we have in the past. The work I do primarily over the past 10 years has been looking at military communities outside the fence line and inside the fence line. And I think it's a real opportunity to showcase what can be done when the communities work together. So I'm looking forward to thinking through with you all how we can use some of the current built environment and reinvent it rather than building more. Thank you.
And fantastic, Carla. Thank you for that. I'm looking forward to hearing that. I think that's this cross industry stakeholder collaboration alignment is proving to be extremely important. I think in real time we're seeing that happen in Florida, where they have been over 50 plus years or even longer, have learned to really work across different communities and groups to build these resilience strategies that they are testing right now in real time as Hurricane Ian comes to Florida. And I saw we have a few guests here from Florida as well. So thank you for joining during this time. But Ed, I want to turn back to you for a little bit. You kind of alluded to that there is some really strong programming that are very critical to getting and developing this curriculum and knowledge base amongst not just energy professionals or city leaders or policymakers to broader industry. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the work you're doing there?
Sure. So I operate at several levels, certainly from the policy level and educational level with GW, and then convening and getting people from various groups, stakeholders together in one place to talk about issues and solutions. But I'm also on the ground too, because I do work in with Native American tribes on resilience at the reservation. And I could talk about some specifics there, but Carla, I know, is going to be talking about specific work that she's doing. So I'd really rather talk about an approach to resilience, because it means a complete change of mindset and how you approach the problem. When climate was a constant, it was much easier to do long-term planning because the impacts were not changing and you had a lot of certainty there. In a lot of ways, it's like being in a war. In the fog of war, you don't know what's coming up. And how do you plan for that when there's so much uncertainty on the field? And Dwight Eisenhower, who I was around for his administration, probably few people here are, who was a great general. And actually, I thought he was a really good president too. He was the one that got the roads built, the interstate highways built, which was quite an effort to do that. So you talk about innovation and resilience, he was really way ahead. Then if you think about how we can get to California in a day, how many days? A day and a half or so, 2 days if you really want to push it. Back then, it would probably take about 3 weeks to do that. But when he was a general, he said something that just really, and he didn't say it to me because I was only about 10 then, but what he said was that plans are useless, but planning is everything. And what he really meant is, in that fog of war, it's the preparation to approach change that really separates the winners from the losers, the good soldiers from the soldiers that are just following. And I try to translate that into work with communities. And let me just talk about that for a second. There's a lot of impacts happening to communities. There's environmental impacts, there's social impacts, cybersecurity, there's uncertainty about availability of energy. There are things that you can't control, but must react to nonetheless. But there are things that you can control. So starting with that kind of that dichotomy there, what I like to talk to people about is that you've got to set up structures so that you're not fixed in any one direction. I had the opportunity to talk to some young leaders at the Department of Homeland Security. They're doing, after about a 6-month educational program, they're doing capstone programs, which are projects that really deep dives into certain areas. And they're all asked to do things on climate change. And if I could share my screen for just a second, I have 2 slides that they seem to work, they thought worked pretty well. And so let me just call these 2 things up. So the question I posed to them, and it's the question now, and it's the question I talk to municipalities about, and the question I talk with tribes about is, what if the planet warming accelerates geometrically, not the way it's going now, but what if it accelerates geometrically? It's accelerating arithmetically at this point. And it could be doing that because of cascading events, melting glaciers, which means there's less reflection, which means everything warms faster, and then you get more wildfires, and then you get soot landing on the glaciers, which melts them. All of this stuff could be happening. The Department of Homeland Security's responsibility is emergency response. Municipalities' responsibility is emergency response. It's also planning to maintain the stability of their utilities. So you need to be thinking about what it means as the future changes for you, so that you're not making investments that then become stranded assets, but you still have to make a decision. So let me talk about this for a second. When climate is a variable and you must act, whether you're working for the federal government, which Carla did for many years, or you're working with municipalities or utilities or industries, which she does now, you need to ask some really important questions. First of all, understanding the impacts and their interactions. But if I step back on that, what I mean to say is that you need a culture in your organization that can adjust quickly and question the questions. There are many questions that have answers, and there are questions that that will be changing, and therefore there are no set answers to them. So whatever you believe is true, you need to must step back, raise yourself up above your situation, try to have some vision on that, and realize that whatever precepts you have are not necessarily true, or they may not be true in the future. So for an organization like the Department of Homeland Security, the questions are things like these. What are the physical considerations of climate change? Harden with resilience or manage retreat, stranded responsibilities. What are the social considerations? Stretch resources, rational solutions are not necessarily accepted, social justice, lower standard of living. What are the psychological considerations? Crime, stress, depression. Can technological assessments save the day? Vulnerability, security, opportunities for AI, machine learning, predict. So as a leader in DHS, as a leader in community, and as a leader in a company, as a leader in the military, you and your organization need to be able to step back and make changes quickly so that you can react to the changes that are happening now. Eisenhower said another thing that really resonates with me too. He said that you must delegate decision-making down to a low level. The soldier in the field must be empowered to make a decision. And there's a good example of that when in 2017 in California, at Lake Orinoco, in 2017 was a big rain year, by the way, massive flooding in California. At Lake Orinoco was overflowing. It's the highest dam in the country, and it was about to be breached. And none of the systems in place were actually working. And it was, as I understand it, it was someone within the bowels of that organization that took an immediate action because they felt empowered to do that, that actually saved the dam. When you think about what happens with crises in communities, fires, earthquakes, it's very often the people in the area that take that first action even before the first responders come there. So a society that's trained to think that way, to be able to take that kind of action, to feel empowered to do that, communities that set themselves up that way, is really a community that has a potential to be resilient as we move into the future. So just coming back to what that meant for the Department of Homeland Security, I said to them, you need to question the organization's systems. For policies, what barriers and chains not are there, but need to be broken, and what will replace them to address growing uncertainty? Think about a municipality. Are you stovepiped in the decisions? Are the decisions made for communities in which the decision makers don't understand those communities? In terms of research and technology investment, how to stay at the leading edge so that you're able to bring in solutions that are now solutions that will work in the future. And one way to think about that is, how do you get that information? There's a lot of assets within a community that are not fixed, that are not enduring. Companies can come and go. Even Microsoft can move in and can move out. Amazon's here in DC now, but they may not be in 10 years. But what are the fixed assets? One of the important fixed assets in communities are the universities. They're really not going anywhere. They can't pick up and move, especially community colleges. The Alexandria, Northern Virginia Community College is not going to move out of Alexandria because that's what it's there to do. There's a bed of research knowledge there that can be integrated into that community, and it's enduring. It will be there in several years. And at GW, one of the things that we're doing now is getting more out into the community and making those services just really available to the local community. I'm going to wrap this up with two more thoughts. Organizational effectiveness. Do decision-making and reporting structures need to change? Probably the most important thing. The locked-in reporting structures can really undermine an organization's ability to be resilient in the future. And workforce preparation. Are people really trained to see themselves as have civic responsibility, and are they feel empowered to take action when necessary? And the workforce is really difficult, so I grew up in the 60s and 70s, so I have a certain perspective on the world. My daughter's in her 30s, her perspective is completely different. If I develop a training program for her generation, I am absolutely going to have to be off because she's into things that I never experienced. So there has to be a bridging of the gap of who's making those decisions and who is actually the decisions are made for. And finally, program evaluation, so you continually have process improvement here. I'm interested to hear from Carla because I like to get into on the ground, talk about a few things too. But there are just a couple of people a couple of things that are just I think are really important that I might leave with you. Two people that I've been fortunate to meet is Gaia Harrington, who just 2 years ago came out with updates to Limits to Growth. I just recommend that book to see what that is. The original Limits to Growth was done in the 70s, but I think that gives you a perspective that you can bring back into a community, into a company, so you understand what those resource constraints are. And then Kate Raworth and the donut economy. If you read those two and understand those two, I think it changes your perspective. The issue, the problem is in what Gaia talks about, but the solution is what Kate talks about. And let me leave that there and turn this over to Carla, who I've known for quite a long time, and I'm always impressed with what she's doing with her time since she left the government when she was a senior official at DOD. So Carla, let me turn this over to you.
Hi, Ed. Thank you so much. And I love your slide. I think it really informs a lot of the discussion. I'll get into what I'm working on, but I noticed a lot of people talked about ecology and nature. And I think going along with what you proposed, Ed, part of having a plan is having a structure for that plan and including nature. Because when we look at all the redesign that's occurring and even some of the gentrification, it's always to build walkways and parks. It's not to leave that aside. And so when we learn from using the current built environment and reimagining it, I think it, of course, includes nature. And there are so many planning tools now that combined recycling, reuse, remanagement that really looks at all the data that we now have that we weren't able to get many years ago when these buildings were built, about ecology of the site, the wildlife needs, and so forth. As we move to things like electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles and have less pollution, all of those things will change. And so I think we're going to look at a changing ecology as much as a changing climate. And that's important to keep in mind. The work that I've done over the past 20 years really has focused on the military and land use in the military, energy use in the military, and all the resources the military uses. Military installations are small cities. Many cover thousands of acres, hundreds of acres. Most were started in remote locations. They generally, the communities are built around them. Many are socially disadvantaged and underserved. So as the military goes to look at its vulnerabilities and do its climate assessments, it also looks outside that fence line. And there's a real opportunity now to capture what the population there needs, and how to make sure that as we look at new policies and regulations and requirements for climate, that we take into account social justice needs. And that's a whole range of issues and a whole range of populations. But there is a great opportunity. I'd also like to share with you that the military actually has had climate change as a threat multiplier and really an awareness point of view for 20 years, even through President Trump. The reason is because the rest of the world is facing climate change. And as other countries experience more adverse reactions, more than we are currently facing, those populations will need help, resources, information. I think one of our best opportunities now to address climate is the opportunity to talk to each other. The one thing the pandemic did is it created an environment for collaboration, constant communication, and constant sharing. And that is the game changer. So when we think about limits to growth, Ed, and things that were done in the past, it was really in a vacuum. You know, each of these authors that have written about climate over the past years didn't have the benefit of a lot of online collaboration, open sourcing, give me your ideas, give me your feedback. So I just see a lot of opportunity. To let you know what the military is doing, they're working with utilities and other energy providers to think through how they become resilient. And one of the ways they become resilient is have a better energy backup system than they have had in the past. And that's by using microgrids. So the military is committed to putting a microgrid on every military installation. That microgrid will give backup power to the military missions and supporting emergency services, but it will also power some of those communities. And when you think about military installations, 100% of civilians live off the installation now, 100%. The people that support the installation, from the soldiers to the workers, and that are required to be on the installation on a daily basis, all generally live off the installation. So it's no more closed communities. And because of that, the military also has a principle of families first. So a soldier's not going to be willing to go to work the next day if they're worried about their family having power, water, and other, resource needs. And so there's a real incentive for the military to collaborate with their communities. And that can be instructive for other communities in which there is no military. There's governmental offices, there's other large resources that you mentioned, universities and community college. And there is a way for us to think about how we share what we need in the future that helps everyone, that reduces our costs, and then we'll take into account, resources, ecology, and helping people who have had really less opportunity. So some of the work I do with the military is having them think through long-term planning. Each military installation is doing what's called a vulnerability analysis. So they actually are doing a formal structured planning exercise. They hire different companies all over the country, and they say, where are our gaps? What are our vulnerabilities? How do we look at climate? And then again, what are the resources, financial and otherwise, needed to make adjustments? And they need to do that for purposes of their military training and missions, as well as to be good citizens of the community. And so they're actively doing that. Another group I work with is called the Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization Model Law Project. And you can look it up. It's lpdd.org. There's a book, Legal Pathways to Decarbonization, and it provides over 1,500 recommendations for cities, towns, the federal government, the state governments to revise policies, requirements, and regulations so that it takes into account climate considerations. And if you go to this website, one of the things that we need to think about is not only what's desirable and what's the right decision making, but what legal tools are needed to allow for this. And a good example is building codes. So right now you have a lot of multifamily housing. You don't have gas stations there, but you want EV chargers there. You literally need to change the building code to put an EV charger on site. Hospitals, community centers, and housing. One of the things we've also looked at is the switch to EVs as we think through needing to have everybody in the world buy a new car. How does the underserved population? So in the past, the Infrastructure Act that was just recently passed, there's a provision to provide tax credits for used EVs. Why did not tax credits, point of sale rebates. And point of sale rebates matter because you get the money up front. People that are living in underserved communities or have a lower income aren't going to get that tax credit. So when we think about how to advance climate change in our own use, in our home use, it's giving things like money back, reducing those initial costs so that everyone can take advantage of this. And when we think of marginalized communities, we really need to think through how they can benefit from the very beginning. So while the White House has, I guess it looks like there's breakouts here. Sorry, I'm going to X that out. While lost my train of thought. Sorry, apologize. But in any case, I guess I'll shift gears here. What I guess Ed and I are thinking through together is what kind of structure needs to be there? What kind of planning needs to be there? How can you include more people? One of the things about underserved and marginalized communities is they're not listening to this webinar.
Mhm.
They're working. They're not going home at night listening to the city council meeting, even if it's virtual. They're working, second job, third job, helping the kids. So we need to think, I think, more broadly about how we reach those communities, whether it's through the local weekend fairs, farmers market, churches, what grocery stores, what are the access points that underserved populations routinely touch, and how can we reach out? And I think I'll stop there and let's go into some conversation.
Carl, I wanted to just, you made an important point there at the beginning that I thought, I'd see if you could expand a little bit, and it talks about military and utility collaboration. And I think in working with the utility side for so long, the minutia in terms of how you get things done in the decision-making process can be very, very long. And so there has to have been like lessons learned on how to streamline that governance process to make projects happen quicker. So just wanted to see if you had any insight there to share that you've seen how they have learned to make decisions faster so that projects and ultimately residents benefit sooner.
Well, one of the ways you make things faster is to improve your federal contracting process. Because anytime the federal government works with the private sector, they actually have to have a contract to do that. There's also trade associations like the Edison Electric Institute. There's the Rural Cooperatives Association. There's the Energy Service Providers Trade Association. So all of these people are routinely talking to the government at both the installation level and at the policy level at DOD. And it's important when you think about it, the military is really 4 separate cabinet agencies. They each have a secretary. It's DOD, but it's Army, Navy, and Air Force. And all of them have their own culture and their own way of operating. So even though climate change is big, each military service is writing their own climate plan. Each military service has their own approach to contracting. So what we need to do inside and working more closely with the military is to try to get them to collaborate more on one path. Because again, it's a contract and it's also a utility. So if you think about the utility world, there's not a lot of differences, right? It's they all have standard ways of operating. They use some type of standard equipment. They have best practices. And they actually now are using technology to find out where outages are and to correct them. It's all, electronic, computerized. So that has helped improve things. But again, I think also it's this notion of planning and vulnerability analysis. When the gaps are identified, the private sector actually has a lot of solutions. The question is, can the military pay for it in a timely manner to quickly get it in place? And in the case of Florida, you saw where at Tyndall Air Force Base, they stored a lot of large airplanes that were quite expensive. Massive hurricane through, and how many $1 billion of later now they're trying to recapture that and repair it and move things. Even with the storm today, they're locking things down and moving things. Well, maybe they need to do some site assessments and think about realigning things or putting other structures in place that will allow them to be more prepared.
Yeah, there's resistance to that, do you think, within the bureaucracy of the government to make the kinds of changes that we're talking about?
I think there is a resistance. And also you look at the General Services Administration, which handles kind of the rest of the government and their built environment, their mobile environment, and so forth. Each agency is having to have their own budget and make their own decisions. There's really, it's great to bring in all the ideas, but there's no plan to say, let's put the money here and fix this. And that sort of is what needs to happen.
Yeah.
But I think also it's up to the private sector to really, once they've gained access, to explain this is how to do it and this is why it works and why it's helpful. So it's building a partnership and having that dialogue. And I know there's a lot of groups out there eager to do that.
Yeah, the analogy in municipalities is kind of the same, except the bureaucracy is a little bit different and the unit of analysis is different too. The military is big, communities are just, just a little bit smaller. But you'd mentioned codes and policies. So policies really matter, don't they?
Policies matter, and it's requirements and directives. So when decisions are made, especially on the defense side, they have to be directed. Once it's written that it's a requirement, then the military will fund it. So right now the military is funding climate change. They're funding vulnerability analysis. It's a directive to do it. They're funding microgrids. It's a directive that they provide not only backup energy, but eventually storage. And when DoD actually led the pathways to renewable energy, investing in a lot of solar, wind, geothermal, storage was a little bit lagging. So now they need to reconnect that. But if you think about military installations, that they were probably built when Eisenhower was president.
Right.
So 75 years later, you can't just add a new connection, an upgrade. You have to redo the system. And Dominion Energy, one of the companies I work with, has that exactly approach. For over 20 years, they've had a base of tomorrow approach, where it is to not just reinvent the system, but modernize, upgrade, and probably redo and redesign. Because what worked in the 1950s is not going to work in 2022.
Right.
Like I said, it's technology, and you can't hook technology into an old pole.
Right.
So
It's almost easier to have a new city like some of the ones in Africa in order to start there rather than start
there.
What we're doing.
But again, no need to waste the current built environment if we can use it. And again, look at ecology, look at livability, walkability, changing resources, adding in parks and other ecological resources that encourage wildlife and nature. Actually, don't eliminate it, but actually encourage it.
Right. Jason, I know we're getting near the end of the hour, but I just want to feed off of one thing that Carla said, actually two things. You talked about technology, and then you talked about vulnerability analysis. And so I'll just give you my experience. You must start a climate action plan with the vulnerability analysis. But as I was saying before, if climate is accelerating, that vulnerability axis has to have a different focus. It has to go out pretty far. And then you have to have a set of structures in place that you can make changes to that plan, which is what Eisenhower was saying. Plans are useless, but planning is what is so important. Technology can really solve problems at the local level, but it's that plan, it's that climate action plan based on the vulnerabilities that are really easy. Technology can solve a lot of things, but it can't keep the toilets flushing when the power is down. So, or the sewage treatment plant working when that power is down. So that plan has got to be, that vulnerability assessment has to be what drives the capital investment, so that you're putting your money in the place that's most impactful now, but is going to be resilient and can withstand changes that are coming up. So you're not running out of money and you can't continue to change. So why is the military looking at that kind of a longer term planning?
Well, I think they're looking at it because, they're going to have to pay for it, whether it's good electricity or bad electricity, they pay for electricity, right? So we want them they are doing exactly what you said. They're doing the vulnerability analysis, then they're doing planning, and they're actually doing solid execution. The microgrid budget was about $20 million a year for several years, just testing it out. Now it's $550 million in this year's National Defense Authorization Act, which is how the military funds their programs. So they are serious about it. And again, it's that requirement that allowed them to spend this money.
Well, Carla, I hate to cut this short, Ed. I think we're right about time, and it is exciting because it's like we're just starting the conversation, which was a good piece there. So I appreciate you guys coming on, and
we can continue the conversation at the actual City of the Future conference in January. I hope we.
So just my quick recap, both from Carla and Ed, is we in terms of resilience and City of the Future, we have to be willing to accept that this unknown variable is becoming increasingly more important, and its magnitude, and we just have to be prepared for that. And then from the applied work that Carla is working on in terms of how you're, especially this microgrid story, which is a whole conference in itself, and how how you bring that to life, how do you create those mechanisms in the public sector, municipalities, and have utilities buy into that in this conversation. And then that final point of equity is really underlined, because we can't get this done if we're not trying and being intentional with how we get everyone involved and being very purposeful in our actions. So I'm very grateful for Ed and Carla for joining us today. This is a fantastic kickoff, and big shout out too to the great conversation happening in the comments is very insightful. So please keep that up. We're all here to learn. Carla, Ed, thank you so much for your time. And now I get to hand it off to Joyce Dooley from Z Prime to kick it off to lead our next conversation. Joyce, I will hand it over to you in this session. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Carla.
Great, thank you very much.